Welcome. My name is Tony Goodman, and I am host of PlaceCast, a series discussing insights into everything about places across the UK, and especially what makes a happy, successful place that people want to visit. With guests from industry, academia, government, including influencers, decision makers, practitioners, and other experts, we will be exploring best practice to identify the latest trends and directions. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this edition of PlaceCast, and I'm delighted to introduce you to my guest this week, Imogen Thompson, who is Executive Director of the Urban Land Institute. Hello,
Hi,
Imogen.
Hi, thanks for having me on today.
It's our pleasure. Please tell us a bit more about yourself and the ULI.
All right. Well, again, thank you for having me join the show. I think the topics that we'll be discussing are extremely important to our industry, and they are garnering a lot of interest right now, so it's a pleasure to be here. My background is in urban planning. I'm an urban strategist by trade, and I've spent the last 17 years working across the world on major regeneration and infrastructure programs, unlocking over £1 billion of government investment in infrastructure schemes and leading on growth portfolios that surround those transport hubs as well. So I come from the industry, but I'm currently the executive director of ULI in the UK. I run all of our membership, research and program of impact here on the UK side. And for those that don't know ULI, we are the Urban Land Institute. We are a global best practice organization that convenes leaders in the built environment in order to effect transformational change. And we're all around the good stewardship and responsible use of land. So that has been our principle since 90 years ago when we were founded in 1936, and it's what we maintain today. So we have a very broad reach globally. We have over 48,000 members and growing. And we have a footprint in over 80 countries worldwide.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested, and we might come back to it, of how you managed to squeeze £1 billion out of the government. But that's
through targeted funding programs, but they're out there if you know where to look.
The main purpose of PlaceCast is to talk about what makes a happy place, what makes it successful, a place that people want to visit, do visit and repeat visit, whether that be the locals or visitors from further afield, particularly in areas of the country that are tourist, green space, and so on. So as a starting point, and from your urban strategist point of view, how do you recognize what elements go to make that a successful place?
I think it's difficult to have a one-size-fits-all when it comes to successful place and happy place as well. But I think that's the beauty of it. For me, I always look for something when evaluating the success of a place or how a place is doing. I look for what I like to call vibrancy, or I call it vibe. You know, if a place has a great vibe and it's vibrant, then it's usually thriving. And you can see that trickle through into local communities, into people who are visiting that see that. But that vibrancy is something that you can't just plug and play. It does need to be created contextually based on the local community, the local requirements, what your objectives are for a scheme if you're building new, and also what the needs are of the local community if you're building into a place where they already are there. I think, there's great examples of vibrancy. King's Cross is always used. Coldrop Yards is a huge success story in terms of how they've used retail and kind of temporary pop-ups to really bring vibrancy to the place, Granary Square. But you even see it in town centers that are looking to revitalize themselves, where if you focus on not just bringing people in to come and go, but to stay, to dwell, and to create vibrancy as a result of that, the place is usually quite successful. And it creates better, more inclusive places. It creates a thriving community as well. But for me, it comes down to vibrancy. A happy place is made through creating a place where people actually want to be and stay and dwell.
And of course, that looks very different in different parts of the country.
Exactly.
So if we talk about King's Cross or anywhere else, but compare that to a small town, the opportunities and the capabilities are very different. And
Yes.
similar things happen in parts of big cities. So King's Cross is obviously, it's quite a big space, but it's a microcosm of central London.
Exactly.
So let's break that down. If you were talking, because, you know, the London experience is different to everywhere else in the country.
Yes.
The only place that gets as crowded is perhaps Edinburgh in August when the festival's on. And one or two beach resorts when it's going to be very hot. So if we took a small town, you know, a high street and a couple of side streets.
Yep.
What's your experience of helping that sort of space to improve, to attract, to be happy? To have the vibe.
Yeah, to have the vibe. Well, I think, you know, localism is key, and engaging local community in order to amplify that is also really important. Because if you're bringing in people, so a community that I have a real fondness for is Whitstable. And so let's use that as an example. During the summer, it is absolutely bustling. And, you know, you can barely walk on the streets, and that's great. But that's also a little bit more seasonal. And so you have this ebb and flow of people who are coming in. They're there for the destination. They're there for the oysters. They're there for the beach and the heat, as you say. So you need to look at something like that and say, well, we need to make sure that there is an anchor here for local community members. And one of the things I've been impressed with is how they've been focusing on using high street shops to host local artists, for example, to have local events hosted in town for local people, pop-up yoga studios, a lot of what I would call, I guess, pop-up advertising as well. So people are willing to highlight other people's wares within their own shops. And it's about building community and a sense of community in that space. It's not just around bringing people in. It's about the people who are already there. And I think that looks very different depending on where you are. I would also say that local input from a governance standpoint is really important. Having policies and having support from councils to actually make sure that these small shops and mom and pop shops are able to survive and thrive is extremely important. I personally think that it's a much better experience, and I want to be in some place that is more locally grounded, more locally focused in terms of the retail offer, in terms of, you know, what's available. And I don't want another Pret necessarily. I'm sorry, Pret, but you know, there's a lot of you already. So I think that that's one of the spaces that is incredibly important for us to support from a policy standpoint, from a rental standpoint. And if we can encourage that localism to really show through, then it does bring people back into the area. I think the other thing I'll say is around using space creatively. If a shop is unable to survive and it goes vacant, having it's the broken window effect, and making sure that we're able to flexibly adapt to spaces and to bring people in and out as we need to create a reason for people to come and check out an area. That's also equally important, instead of looking at the longer term kind of static leases from larger companies that can afford it, maybe, you know, temporary leases or short-term leases, and making sure that there's that continuous flow of things in an area that bring people there.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the principal infills for that type of premise traditionally has been a charity shop. And charity shops was always somewhere where you look to pick up bargains. But as time's progressed, there are a number of charity shops now that are specialists in vintage clothes, in toys, in books, in whatever, as other things have disappeared from the high street. And as not everyone else feels as comfortable risking buying vintage clothes, say, or second-hand clothes on the internet.
Yeah.
So even that traditional, I mean, and I think the world well, certainly the UK saw this a huge amount during COVID, when so many businesses had to close their doors, including charity shops.
Yeah.
But it did leave afterwards a lot of vacancies.
Yes.
And charity shops, you can't have 6 charity shops on a high street and expect any vibe unless those charity shops find a niche reason for people to visit them. And it's good to see that some of them have. Now, obviously, that's not the only thing. And I think it's also easy to forget, as you mentioned with Whitstable, that it's a seasonal town.
Yes,
but there's a lot of people live there.
Absolutely. And I love staying on the off season. So me and my partner will head down and we'll spend what we like to call storm season for a long weekend. And, I think that that's one of the most brilliant times because you really do meet local community members if you're going into the cafes or you're shopping locally. But it really empties out. And that seasonality is super obvious in places like Whitstable and all across the country as well. You need to find a way to anchor your community into an area and to get your local community members, give them a reason to come out to these shops as well, especially in a more digitally leaning society at the moment. It's very easy to do online retail, but as you said as well, specialists, experiential real estate, I like to call it, give people a reason to come there to experience it. It's more than just something you can do online. It's something you have to do in person. That's a really great way to draw people into an area and to create vibrancy at the same time.
And one of the other aspects of it is that if you don't manage to do that, a lot of those businesses that thrive in the tourist season, if the weather's bad or during the off season, they may not survive.
Yeah.
And therefore there becomes nothing for the locals. So to make the place successful for everyone, there has to be a balance. And it's achieving that balance that's so difficult to do.
It's really interesting when you talk about balance, because I think there's 2 ways that you can go about it and see it. And actually, I don't think I think it's in the middle that we need to be doing it. The one is top down, and you can be very prescriptive around, what goes on your high street. And from a council standpoint, you can be very regimented in terms of your perfect mix. But at the same time, that may potentially exclude great ideas and pop-up installations and local artists and places that are a little bit more bottom-up and grassroots and coming forward with an idea, someone who's entrepreneurial, who thinks they might. So, how do you balance this and how do you create that perfect recipe? Again, it comes down to the context of the place. And I do think that we should, as people and professionals in the built environment, we should have a little bit more of a hand in not just steering, but supporting that diversity of business and helping curate how you create vibrancy in a place. But ultimately, it comes down to what the community wants and needs. And that's an extremely organic thing.
It is. So we've talked about the local small town. When you get to medium-sized towns, cities, and so on, and let's exclude London for a minute.
Well, I would say that's a very big city.
It is a very big city, and it's really a series of small towns.
Yes. Yeah.
But in the medium size, what we often talk about is the quarters, and there may very well be more than 4 of them, which any mathematician will object to. But Manchester, for instance, which is my hometown, has a series of quarters, from an Arndale centre through to Market Street, which is the main shopping street, which bridges onto the Arndale through to various squares that are used for shopping. And what's become very well known, the Northern Quarter, which was all Victorian textile warehouses that have now is an area that has a tremendous vibe with nightlife, with cafes and restaurants and so on, as well as many others. In your role talking about urban strategy, do you see these as being best having separate identities, or do they need corridors that join them together and have thematic roles to enhance each other?
That's a really interesting question, because you'll hear me, in my personal and professional capacity, you'll hear me talk about narrative and identity a lot. And I do think that this is key to unlocking opportunities within a place. But I don't think that it has to be as granular as, well, this is my identity and this is your identity. I think that together it tells a very compelling story. You have history and you have defined areas that contain that history, that have benefited from or been subject to that history. And I think that being able to identify that lends itself to the identity of a place, and therefore the feel of a place, the character of a place, the perhaps current focus of a place. But do you need to join them up? I think that that's a piece for a wider regional or, citywide narrative, and that is where it all comes in to play. I think that, let's look at not just Manchester, but the West Midlands and Birmingham, for example. Birmingham has a very clear narrative around its development that's coming forward. It also has quarters, and it's been putting a lot of investment into its areas for regeneration. Big projects are coming forward. Infrastructure is lending itself to unlocking those areas. So there is that connectivity piece massively. But that sits at a different level than the identity of a neighborhood. And so, again, I think that you're right in that identity is really important, but I don't think that we need to necessarily say it's kind of either separate or connected. I think it has to be a bit of both. The identity of the jewelry quarter is exactly that, but the impact of Birmingham's strategy on how you connect that through walking and cycling routes, where you're building your housing in the city, where you're placing your cultural anchors, such as the BBC in Digbeth. All of this plays into that wider strategic focus. And I think that it's not about these distinct neighborhoods. It's about what knits them all together. So a neighborhood can sit separately, but if you don't have good connectivity across a city, it's not going to be a great experience anyways. But they don't have to blend together. They can have distinct identities and still be a fantastic part of a whole city's story.
And another part of that, and I agree with you completely, another part of that is that we're all individuals. We all want different things from the experience, and we often want different things at different times. So not everyone wants to shop in Poundland every week, and not everyone wants to shop in Harvey Nicks.
Yep.
Exactly. So producing a range and clustering things around those seems to be a way of creating identities for different areas, different quarters. In London, I would say there are quarters within towns within London.
Yep. And when I first came to the UK, I was renting a flat in Camden. And that was my first experience of the punk identity of Camden 12 years back. And, that is still very much there today, albeit there's been a little bit of a facelift to the market. But yeah, the distinct neighborhoods are, I think, part of the charm and the wider narrative of a place. And, you raised a very important point as well that I would like to mention, which is around people. Ultimately, everyone has different needs and wants and is moving through their lives differently. And all of that is framed within the context of cities and places and the urban fabric that they move through. And our industry is an inherently human one. And I think it's really easy to forget that as well, because we talk about the type of shops, we talk about, office space, we talk about retail or leisure or commercial as asset classes. But ultimately, it comes down to the people who are using them and interfacing with them in public realm. It's no good without people there. So, ultimately, we need to dial it back to people, both local and kind of coming in as visitors, and try and understand better what they need and what they want and what will make it a great experience for them as well.
You mentioned public realm, and often when I'm talking to bids or talking to councils, their ambitions are capped by financial resources, and often the things that they focus on are what is achievable, not just desirable, but achievable. And a lot of that comes down to minor public realm work. So things like getting the signage right so people can find the way around, introducing flora into the area, both to make it better looking, but also to break up the monotony of straight line walking. The importance of doing basics like keeping an area clean and safe are very important to locals, and many surveys have shown this. I was talking to one bid recently where in their renewal bid they did a questionnaire, and cleanliness and safety came top, before anything else. That's what people want. They want to be in a nice environment.
And I'll say that because anecdotally, we hear this all the time, and the industry, the developers and the investors that we work with, but also me personally from my past professional experience, the amount of times we try and over-design or implement really shiny, wonderful, urban design features or public realm improvements, and we haven't talked to local community, and therefore it's completely defunct for what they actually need, is fascinating to me, because a lot of times we invest in these spaces thinking, well, who wouldn't want this? But actually, if we talk to local communities, you do realize that there's specific needs. There's a hierarchy of needs, and that differs no matter where you go. So having those conversations is essential to understanding what actually will make a difference in an area to locals, to people. And my call to action is that we need to do that far more and from an earlier stage as an industry as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of aspects of towns that I want to explore with you. One, and I should mention, you mentioned when you first came to this country and that you're Canadian.
Yes, I am.
So one of Canada's most famous exports, apart from you, has now forever changed the high street, which is the coffee shop.
Oh, well, I am very pleased to hear that coffee shops are attributable to Canadian exports.
Well, Starbucks, and
yes,
starting in Seattle and so on.
Exactly.
So, when I was brought up, when I was younger, there were no coffee shops around, or virtually no coffee shops around. You couldn't get coffee in a pub. You couldn't. Now you can't move a few meters, and there are streets in my local town, Altrincham. There's one street that probably has 8 coffee shops on it, and the street is only about 150 meters long. And actually on days when the sun is shining, it's wonderful because everyone is sat outside all of them, and they're all busy and thriving, and it creates a great atmosphere, even if you're not stopping at the shop, just walking through.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's changed the high street dramatically over the last 10 or so years is online.
Yes, absolutely.
And so how do you see, and sorry, also to add that coping with those, and one leads to the other. If you've got empty shops, filling it with a coffee shop or a restaurant makes a lot of sense. But how do you see, one, how that change has evolved, and two, where do you think it's going next?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I do think that it has evolved, and I am personally on the side of social media hasn't done us any favors. I think that in an increasingly digital time, we have all become a little bit more individually focused, individually narrowed. And what that has done as well is taken away the impetus to meet. I think as a result of that, we saw a really strong rowing back of what I like to call third places. And that is closure of pubs on high streets. They haven't been able to make rents, and not as many people are going to them. Community spaces, slightly less demand for them. And so I think that has been a real transition. I don't think it's going anywhere. in terms of the digital aspect of our lives. It will only get more and more integrated. And that is something that we've had to adapt to. I think the high street conversation is a perfect example of that. Retail, as a result of digitalization, has been a significant impact. And for a while, actually, because people weren't shopping in stores, high streets have suffered. Retail became a bit of a dirty word for investors. And, you know, it's really changed the horizon of how we operate within that space. However, nowadays, there's great examples of people coming back to retail because they see a product on social media. They go to an area to experience that. Retailers are having pop-up shops and pop-up experiences to bring people in. So brand collaborations, collabs, as they like to call them. And then people are not necessarily buying in stores, but they're there to experience that, to see what's available, and then they'll still buy online. So actually, there's been a real shift in how we use digital to interface with the spaces around us and with, you know, shops, with places, with awareness of products or opportunities that are coming forward in the built environment or through a shop. It is really interesting to see that. But I do think that going forward, I feel optimistic that we can make it work, but it is an increasingly challenging space. And I think that our industry is not a particularly fast-moving one, whereas digital and tech is moving at breakneck speed. And so there's this misalignment between how fast we're adapting as a built environment industry versus how fast tech is progressing, and therefore how it's going to impact the requirements of the buildings that we're building today. Are we going to need offices in the same way in 10, 20 years with the advent of agentic AI? It's a question. Are we going to have, you know, in-person retail purchase opportunities, or will it simply become fully experiential because you can get everything online and have it sent to you in a warehouse? Do we need in-person grocery stores if it's all available on Tesco Whoosh? I don't know. There's a question of how we deal with that. And I personally feel a little hesitant that we're not doing enough to make sure that we're adapting and focusing back on the human element. I think there's a very real risk that we are not going to be inclusive for individuals like those with digital poverty issues, or those who are perhaps older and have not interfaced with technology as much. We're not necessarily thinking about it holistically enough, and I would like us to do that a little bit more. It sounds a little doom and gloom, but I do think there's some serious challenges for us to adapt to. We've clearly done it. The occupiers and the retailers are thinking very closely about it. The tech side of things is moving in an amazing fashion forward, but you know, built environment industry is a little old school. We should be more open to innovation and adaptation.
I agree with your caution, and it's an area where there is a huge risk of societal loss.
Yeah.
Because traditionally, the high street with the butcher, the grocer, and all the others, the bank, cause people to have, and of course, very much the pub, cause people to have exposure to society on an ongoing daily basis. You walk along your local high street and you nod to someone, or you stop and talk to someone or whatever. If everything's online and you lose that, there's a danger with a lot of high streets, as happened with out of town, that they start to die off, and that local societal benefit is lost. So the challenge for a lot of smaller places, but lots of places, is how do they combat that? And that must be a question that is you talk about and is raised with you.
It is a question that's raised with us. There isn't an answer as of yet. I think as an example, which I'm devastated about, is that our local butcher has recently closed. It's a prime example of this, and they've been around for, I think, 3 generations in their East London location, and they have had to shut their doors. But equally, there are butcher boxes that you can get from British farms. And British farms will be able to tell you exactly, the cow that your butcher's meat came from, what products you can select, and then it comes kind of freezer packed and ready for you to consume. And so, from one side of things, as a consumer, you still have access to a lot of things, an incredible range of things as well. But I completely agree. From a place perspective and a community perspective, we do risk losing touch with those around us. The other example I like to use is on the tube. And I always use this as a little bit of a litmus test of how people are feeling about technology at the moment. I commute into the office every day, and I always look around and I see everyone on their phones, head down, scrolling. And, you can tell they're scrolling because they're doing the finger movement and they're scrolling through the phone. And to me, what that also means is that you're probably not reading the news as much. You are not necessarily reading a book. And I always look at how many people are on their phones versus not on anything versus reading either a newspaper or a physical book. And I find that, I don't actually know what that data actually stacks up to, but for me, I find that a very interesting thing to observe on a daily basis to see whether we are, I guess, enamored with technology, or maybe there's a little bit of hope for the future. And I have seen a lot of physical copy books on the tube recently. And so to me, I wonder if there is, we hear about younger generations talking about removing themselves from digital or from social media a little bit more. Perhaps there's a backlash to all of this where we will start to see people coming back into their communities, into a more analog way of life and embracing that. But then I wonder if we will have lost all the spaces that facilitate that in this interim space, and then we risk not having a high street, not having third spaces, not having the local pub, and therefore where do we gather even if we want to? So it's an open-ended question. I'm curious to know what listeners also think about that as well. But yeah, it's one that I think about often.
I think it'll stimulate a lot of discussion. Also, one of the aspects that made this a lot worse, but possibly caused a reaction to it later, was COVID, where we were all forcibly removed and isolated. And, I remember being out walking the dogs and talking to people in the neighborhood that I knew from across the road, literally shouting across the road because you didn't get any closer. And that isolation, I think, which went on for a very long time and was extreme for a lot of people, I think maybe had a reaction that people, when they were allowed to and they felt confident again, have gradually moved back to busier places and more demand for making those places better.
Yeah.
So,
and I'll quickly say, I've been observing London pre, during, and post-pandemic, and it's fascinating because I think right now London is busier than I ever saw it before the pandemic. And I could not give you the numbers to stack up, but I go to Borough Market, for example, absolutely packed. You go to pubs in central London, Covent Garden, it's heaving, and it's not even peak tourist season at the moment. And so I feel like there is this coming back where people almost realize the importance of it or the value of it, even to them individually, and they seek it out. We're inherently social beings, and I think that our urban fabric should facilitate that coming together as much as possible, but we also need to see the value in that, and something like a pandemic will really push us towards that as well.
Yeah, and while we're talking about London, I've been a regular visitor to London on business and personally for many, many years. And as quite often as a frequent visitor, but, perhaps more occasionally and not at all during COVID, perhaps I see changes more pronounced than the locals do. And one of the things that I've noticed is the locals will all talk about how ULEZ and charging has made it more difficult to get around the town. But I find in the town centre that all those cars are being replaced by bikes, and the roads are just as busy, but it's now with bikes.
Yeah.
And, the accessibility of the bikes, so many that you can just pick up, go to where you want, drop it off, and so on, is actually a great innovation for moving around. Yeah. And of course, there is the tube to help you get around.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that I find is there are certain parts, and Camden is one of them, where you can barely walk on the pavement. It's so busy.
Yes.
And that's an interesting change as we get more mobile. I guess one of the key lessons in usability, we've gone for years in pedestrianising high streets and so on, or surrounding streets or squares or whatever. The interface in use between private transport, public transport, pedestrians, and I guess the further one is bikes.
Yeah.
And again, with a huge change now that there are electric bikes, which are encouraging more people, but perhaps making it slightly more dangerous. How do you see that amalgam and the way of splitting them out and using them differently, but to maintain accessibility whilst maintaining that nice environment?
Well, I guess I see it from a slightly different lens. We actually just did a piece of research on sustainable mobility modes and unlocking growth and development. And it's really interesting to see from examples around the world, the fact that a lot of sustainable mobility, you think it's kind of for connectivity purposes, but it also stimulates opportunities from a growth standpoint, from a vibrancy standpoint. I think ultimately how one is using the road and connecting places to each other is a different conversation. But I'm in two camps on the busy streets and can't walk on the pavement, because on one side I'm now that local who's going, oh gosh, I wish I could walk in my own neighborhood. But on the other side, that vibrancy is what is pulling those people there in the first place. And that is an amazing thing to see in a time when the economy is tough, cost of living is high, to see all of these people coming out, and some of them just to sit, use Camden as an example, sit canal side, hang out with their friends, chat, maybe have a pint. It is wonderful. And the kind of electric bikes and scooters is a different thing, because from a safety and mobility standpoint, do you regulate, do you not? It's a different conversation. But I think that access into these places is what has enabled people to come there in the first place. And, we live in a very connected world now. Mobility is really important to allow people to convene in certain places on a regular basis. And I think that walking and cycling is one of the ways that you increase dwell time in an area. We see it in the Healthy Streets guides from Transport for London. We see it in a lot of places where if you create pedestrianized or walking and cycling routes to an area, you'll have a lot more people dwelling and coming and staying. If you have cars on high streets, they're coming for a purpose. They park, they get their groceries, they go. There's a lot of research that's been done around this. I think it's a great thing to have a place that is accessible and that is not car-centric, it's people-centric. And that to me is a real positive around London. I think the other thing with ULEZ that's fascinating is looking at the statistics of how it has improved the air quality across London. It's a massive, massive uptick. And as someone who lives and works and spends leisure time in London, I personally am a big fan of my lungs getting a little bit more fresh air on a daily basis. So it's been nice to see that converts over to people using sustainable mobility modes in order to access their place of work or to access their community spaces. It's brilliant.
It is, but you say the lungs. The former Prime Minister, William Pitt, described Hyde Park as being the lungs of London. that the green space was there to absorb. And yes, and I think one of the things that's made the biggest difference in London to that is not removing private cars. It's very much converting the buses and delivery vehicles to electric, because they were the worst offenders quite often, especially when they were, it wasn't unknown to get a 50-year-old bus still on running the route. So that always made it difficult.
Yeah.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about that I was referring to before, when we talk about high streets and small towns, one of the things that isn't often considered as that is something that I know you've got personal experience of, which is the retail park, the shopping centre and whatever. Because those are mini towns or mini high streets, and in a lot of cases, not so mini. So I know you've had involvement in that. Do you want to talk about that and the comparison and how they interact with other socialized centres in an area and so on?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to touch on it. And, I have previously worked on the Brent Cross regeneration project back in Canada. I was working on the Oak Ridge Shopping Centre redevelopment, so a huge, basically conversion of a shopping centre while it's still operational into 13 towers, residential, a public park on top of it, all of these things. And, I think that there is a really strong historic element to shopping centers and a very North American thing around shopping centers as well, because in the mid-century, they were very much in vogue. We saw the typical North American archetype of a shopping center come into the UK, got plonked there, big car parks around. Us Canadians have been doing it for ages as well. Felt like a great model then. I find it easy to vilify them because from an exterior standpoint, you do have this very, again, car-centric. You're coming in. I mean, Brent Cross, it's difficult to get to as a pedestrian. And I say that being an absolute fan of the master plan that's going on there. But crossing the A406 as a human being is very challenging. I think that it's very easy to vilify them. But what you do also see these days, and you see it in the Westfields, you see it in Brent Cross, you see it in shopping centers everywhere, is that it's a congregation space. And it is one of those spaces where, sure, it's retail focused, but it is also a third space. It's where teenagers can come and hang out after school and meet with their friends and, get a milkshake or a bubble tea or something and just be around each other. And I think that they do play a very important role because it's not so much about the shops within them, but it's the spaces that are connected in between them. And one of the things that I've done on past shopping center redevelopment projects is make sure that those routes of connectivity are extremely or are very much the focal points of the project, because it is less so about the individual shops themselves, but it's also about those places where people can dwell, can stay, can come and have a coffee or a meal. The retail is now secondary, I think, to the experience that a shopping center lends to a community and the space that it gives them to just hang out. And that's why I think it's really important to focus on shopping centers. If you're going to redevelop them, make sure that they're redeveloped with humans in mind, not the retail offer, but the experience, because that will draw people to them and it will maintain them as a space that people can simply congregate. And you might get a few purchases on the side, but I think that's really important to remember.
So in looking at that, should we differentiate them from other high streets, traditional high streets and town centres? Are they just another house street, the bigger ones, another town centre? You might almost call them a new town that are there to cope with expansion rather than fulfil a different need.
I think it's actually around connectivity. So would I class them as alternative high streets? Probably not, because I do see them as historically having diminished from high street demand. They transferred that demand and those anchor points over to shopping centers, and so they took away from local high streets. But they themselves became and morphed into a gathering place. And so, how we manage them going forward, I think it's around how you connect them. And I'll use the Brent Cross project as an example. The plans in place, and I know that these are a little bit in flux, but it's around connectivity from the new town centers that are being created as part of the southern aspect of the master plan across the A406 into the shopping center. It's around what you do around the exterior of the shopping center. It's around how you transform the shopping center itself. And whatever that ends up looking like, it's really important to make sure it connects into other places in a cohesive way. If you have it as an isolated space, it is going to become an us versus them kind of spatial competition. Whereas if you have very clear ability to move across and between the spaces, then it becomes part of the community. It becomes part of that journey that a person is taking from point A to point B, and making sure that the journey makes sense, that there's, a very clear rationale as to why means that it's part of the community, not separate to it. So I think there's great ways that you can design shopping centers to be part of the community. I don't necessarily think they need to be in competition with high streets. They can be an extension of them.
But if we were looking forward,
mm-hmm.
and there have been shopping centres, retail parks that have failed, closed, been pulled down. But if we were looking forward from a planning point of view, would you recommend that a shopping centre should be built as part of the town centre, as it is, for instance, in places like Bury? I don't know if you're familiar with Bury. Or should it be something that's completely separate, so it's catering for a different need in perhaps closer to an area which doesn't have as much of a community centre or, that retail environment going on?
Again, I would probably say it comes back to context and what is needed in the area. If there's already a high street and a flourishing area, maybe you need to look at that very carefully. But in other contexts, it could work very well. And the other thing that I think, which I really believe comes down to design and people-centric design, is that shopping centers don't need to be a big box. They can be very cleverly designed into local areas. They can have high levels of amenity space. They can have incredible community hubs. There's work happening across the country that where they turn vacant areas into community gathering spaces or free Wi-Fi hubs for remote working. Temporary and flex and meanwhile uses in shopping centers themselves. And so I think it's very easy, again, to vilify the mid-century shopping center archetype, where you've got a very big box. It's usually very concrete, very blocky, not particularly, full of light or anything. And I think it comes down to what a place needs, what people want in the area, and what makes sense from a retail standpoint as well. So I don't think that you can simply say one or the other. You could very easily build a shopping center that makes complete sense, and equally you can put one in and it would just completely fail. I think Westfield is a really good example of spaces where they look contextually at where they place their shopping centers, where they're investing in, and what they're focused on as well from an amenity standpoint.
Okay. It's a fascinating area. As we draw this talk to a conclusion, if you were to think 10 years ahead about our high streets, towns, and so on, what would you like to look back on and say, that was one of the best innovations made to support what we've talked about as being a community, society, place that makes it into a happy place? What innovations can you think of that would, in retrospect, look good to you?
I think I'll go. I think I'll go for kind of two comments on that. The first is around. I personally would love to see more rent controls for small businesses, and I would love to see councils, regardless of the business case for it, really prioritizing locally led, locally focused retailers and shops and experiences. And I think that would be a really incredible thing to see, because I think small businesses need a lot of support in today's economy, but they are some of the most interesting ones that I see on any high street. And that's what I want to go to a high street for. I don't want to go for, the big chain coffee shops. I want to go for the local shop that makes the best flapjack in town. I want to go for the coffee that has the really good roasted beans. So I would love to see rent controls and more support for small businesses. I would also like to see a really strong focus on the public realm and the things that increase the dwell time for people. I think that it's very easy to assume, build it, and people will come, but actually community-led urban realm design is one of the best ways to engage your community from young ages, from current community levels, to come into a space. And I'll use my local example around East London as well. So I worked on a community project where we co-designed pocket parks to take up parking spaces. And we did this with local children and local businesses in order to design them and make sure that they were places that people actually wanted to be. And the dwell time on the street has increased, and the council is tracking this. And it's been an incredible result, but it's not just because we did it, it's because we did it with community. And I think that there creates a buy-in and almost a pride of place that is extremely important to getting people to engage with high streets, to take care of their high streets, and to want to be on their high streets as well. So I think working on that public realm design, but doing it with community in mind, creates pride of place that just cannot be replicated.
Imogen Thompson, thank you so much for joining us on PlaceCast today.
Thank you, Tony.